Christopher Columbus' 1492 expedition was not an innocent adventure or scientific breakthrough. It was the opening move in a systemic project of violent wealth extraction. Columbus was less a discoverer and more a contractor of empire. Funded by financiers with deep links to Europe's elite banking networks, including the Medici, as well as surviving Templar networks, his voyage was an investment venture built on conquest. The promise was gold, the method was force. Columbus's landfall in the Caribbean launched a new political economy based on the dispossession, enslavement, and extermination of indigenous peoples. The gold, silver, and human labour expropriated from the Americas would become the base material for Europe's imperial ambitions. His so-called discovery set off a feedback loop of extraction and violence that financed Europe's wars, built its palaces, and fed its illusions of divine destiny. Columbus's voyage was not funded by monarchs alone. Banking families like the Medici were at the heart of this imperial project. The Medici's Seville branch had deep involvement in Atlantic trade and financing of early voyages, as detailed in Richard Goldthwaite's The Economy of Renaissance Florence. These families were not passive inheritors of colonial wealth. They were strategic architects of empire, underwriting the violent expeditions that brought bullion back to Europe. As we'll see in an upcoming episode in this series, the gold did not circulate to support broad economic development. Instead, it inflated financial speculation, deepened monarchic debt, and funded perpetual warfare across Europe. These bankers extended credit to monarchs at high interest, plunging states into cycles of dependency. Financial institutions became parasitic extraction economies. Gold from the Americas fueled Europe's imperial operations abroad and its rot at home. The elite never intended for the wealth to trickle down. The system was rigged to consolidate capital and maintain political control. Gold was the means, but domination was the end. The gold that came to line European treasuries came soaked in blood. In the mines of Hispaniola and later in the mountain of Potosi, labour was death. Indigenous workers were subject to forced labour systems inherited from and twisted beyond pre-Columbian models. Men, women and children were sent into the mines without safety, food or rest. Life expectancy in the mines was often measured in just mere months. When indigenous populations collapsed under the pressure, the transatlantic slave trade ramped up. Millions of Africans were captured, transported and worked to death in the Americas to keep the flow of gold and silver uninterrupted. Behind the treasure fleets sailing into Seville and Lisbon were the broken backs and erased lives of countless human beings. This was not development. It was annihilation. It was not wealth creation. It was theft on a civilizational scale. And its details I find almost too horrific to explore, but are outlined in numerous texts, including a short account of the destruction of the Indies and the history of money in America. The ecological cost mirrored the human one. Landscapes were stripped bare, water tables poisoned, forests felled to fuel smelting and shipping. The environmental scars remain to this day. The raw bullion extracted from the Americas did not sit idle in European vaults. It was transformed through financial alchemy into power. Banks converted metal into credit instruments. Credit became debt. Debt became political leverage. States borrowed heavily against future conquest. Speculation and financial instability followed. Inflation actually preceded the arrival of precious metals, but in Spain, where gold poured in fastest, it did hit hard. The volatility was profitable for some, financiers thrived, monarchs borrowed to fund wars, debt and currency manipulation became the key tools of empire. And yet none of this chaos was inevitable. As we have seen previously, centuries earlier, Marco Polo had described how Kublai Khan built a powerful economy using fiat currency paper, money backed by sovereign authority rather than physical metal. Khan's system was enforced by legal codes and administrative discipline. It did work, it circulated, and it did last. Europeans knew of this system. Marco Polo's writings were widely read. But Europe rejected this model, and it chose gold, not because it had to, but because it wanted to. Gold offered more than liquidity. It gave the illusion of permanence. It confirmed a divine order. It justified violence. Fiat money required trust in institutions. Gold required only conquest and blood. The Renaissance was not a neutral revival of classical learning. It was a strategic project of cultural engineering, considered previously. The Medici and their peers did not just fund voyages, they funded art, architecture, and religion as a means of political control, as outlined in the Italian Renaissance by Burke. Paintings, cathedrals, and universities became tools of narrative construction. The brutal economics of empire were dressed in the aesthetics of progress. Columbus's voyages were woven into tales of providence and civilizing mission. Artists were commissioned to depict divine order and European virtue. Scientific discoveries were framed as the fruit of European genius. In reality, the wealth that funded this flowering of culture came from plunder, extraction, and slavery. The Renaissance was a spectacle built to conceal a crime. Culture was not separate from conquest. It was its mask. The art was beautiful. The system was not. Gold and silver extracted through violence in the Americas created vast pools of liquidity for European elites. That wealth was not simply stored or consumed, it was channeled into cultural production. Paintings, sculptures, churches, and public festivals became the chosen vessels for turning raw plunder into prestige. The book, The Open Veins of Latin America, outlines how colonial extraction created a cycle of wealth and power for European elites with cultural institutions, such as churches, reinforcing imperial legitimacy. The cultural output was not innocent or decorative. It built reputation, moral justification, and institutional authority. The elite used art to portray themselves as wise, pious, and destined to rule. Culture provided a mask for the empire. The brutality of conquest was dressed in beauty. The violence was given the appearance of a divine order. And that cultural legitimacy then looped back to justify continued extraction. Artists depicted rulers as chosen by God. Explorers were painted as saviors. Religious commissions affirmed conquest as a sacred duty. The institutions of art and religion sanctified inequality in empire. In doing so, they encouraged more of both. The cycle became self-perpetuating. Violence produced gold wealth. Wealth funded cultural production. Culture legitimized violence. Finance directed the entire process. Renaissance patrons did not simply support the arts. They used art as a strategic investment and driver of personal wealth. They created a new kind of asset class. These were not objects of utility, but instruments of power. A painting or a marble statue had no economic necessity. A fresco had no productive function, but with enough narrative, symbolism, and institutional reinforcement, they became stores of value. They conveyed status, they commanded reverence, they secured control. Art became a form of currency. Paintings were portfolios of legitimacy. Churches served as vaults of spiritual and political credit. Cultural objects operated as instruments of elite coordination. Their value came from meaning, not function. Their purpose was really to consolidate dominance. Renaissance elites engineered this system with the same intent and precision they brought to coinage and credit. They minted cultural capital as deliberately as they minted money. The result was a loop that reinforced itself. Violence funded culture, culture justified power, finance organized both. In this table, I've outlined Renaissance cultural production with the exploitation of the Americas. In this system, aesthetics became a tool of governance and control. Culture did not reflect power, it enabled it. It made plunder look sacred and inequality look completely normal. The beauty of Renaissance art was not a sign of moral progress, it was evidence of a well-constructed illusion. Resource extraction, finance, and culture were not independent phenomena. They were interconnected, parts of a single machinery of domination. Extraction provided the raw wealth. Finance turned that wealth into instruments of control. Culture translated the control into legitimacy. The Medici were not simply bankers or art patrons. They were central operators in a system where violence funded culture, culture justified violence, and finance controlled both. Their churches were monuments to divine order. Their vaults held the proceeds of empire. Their libraries were stocked with classical texts and colonial propaganda. They embodied the total system. This was not an accident, it was a strategy, and it worked. The story of Columbus and the Renaissance is not a celebration of discovery or genius. It is a case study in how power is constructed, justified, and sustained. The gold of the Americas did not build a prosperous Europe. It built a brittle one, riddled with debt, corruption, and decay. The cultural splendor of the Renaissance was not a sign of ethical maturity. It was a camouflage reality for brutality. Columbus was not a hero, he was a broker of violence. The Medici were not enlightened humanists, they were financial engineers of empire. The Renaissance was not a rebirth. The Medici did not just amass wealth through banking and art patronage, they cemented their power by marrying into royal families across Europe. These strategic alliances extended their influence beyond finance and culture and embedded them into the fabric of European political power. It was another layer in the control system, blending economic dominance with dynastic legitimacy. To understand this history clearly is to reject the myths that have long obscured it. The systems of extraction, finance, and cultural production that actually began in antiquity continue today in new forms. Modern corporations extract resources under conditions similar to colonial exploitation. Global financial institutions impose debt regimes that keep nations dependent. Cultural industries appropriate colonized heritage to reinforce dominant narratives. Trade agreements protect oligarchic interests over labour and the environment. Racial and economic hierarchies from conquest and slavery still shape global power. The legacy of conquest still shapes our global order. To dismantle that legacy, we first must see it for what it truly is. Now, thanks so much for joining me. Do consider having a look at the other videos in this playlist, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye bye.